So we're in your United States history book. We're in chapter 2, and we're going over the 13 colonies and how they were formed. And we got to the proprietary colonies. Proprietary colonies are where the king would give this land in America to a certain person, a proprietor owner, to bring in people kind of wanting to promote the feudal system, the system of that was in Europe with the knights and the lords and the castles and all of that, bringing that old feudalism to America. They wanted to do that, but it didn't work that way, as we find out. But we do have some of these colonies that were founded by proprietors, so William Penn being one of them, and he founded Pennsylvania. So there was what's called the Society of Friends, and these were, another name for them were Quakers, and they were in England, and they were pretty much separated from the church. So the Quakers definitely wanted to leave the Anglican church from England and come to America. So a lot of them did, and especially William Penn. So the Quakers believed each man is to follow his inner light and to worship from his heart. The Quakers had no ministers, no prescribed worship, and they met in meeting houses. They were very much pacifist, and they refused to go into the military. So there are some characteristics of Quakers. So they were very different from the Church of England, that's for sure. Well, William Penn was a Quaker, but he also was the son of a wealthy, prestigious Englishman. He lived 1644 to 1718, and he became a Quaker as a young man. But his dad was very much friends of the King of England, Charles II. And Charles II owed his father large sums of money. So when William's father died, he inherited the claim of this money. But King Charles, he wanted to repay him, not with money, but with land in America. So he said, I'll give you this land grant in America in the New World to pay your father's debt for you, or to pay my debt to your father's, not your father's debt, but my debt that I owe to your father. So he would give Pennsylvania onto William Penn to found this land in America. It says here in 1681, William Penn was granted a charter for the land between Maryland and New York. King Charles was in debt to his father, Penn's father, and Penn was a Quaker, so this gave him the rights for the freedom of religion and the right to have elected public officials in America. So it was right up what he wanted to do anyway. And so he was great and happy and joyful to have been granted this land by the king due to his the king's debt to his father. Pennsylvania. In 1681, you can see where Pennsylvania is there in the map there, right below New York, right above Maryland there, and New Jersey and Ohio, New Jersey on the east and Ohio on the west. In 1681, King Charles grants Sylvania. Sylvania means forest, so Penn, Sylvania, Penn meaning the Penn family, Sylvania meaning forest land, north of Maryland to Penn, William Penn. And they called it Pennsylvania in honor of Penn's father. The king was not careful to define the boundaries, though, so for years and years they disputed over the boundaries. Actually, for 75 years until the Mason-Dixon line came in, they disputed over the boundaries of Pennsylvania, especially with Maryland. Pennsylvania was to be a haven for Quakers. Penn's dream was for Quakers' religious freedom, so that they could worship freely, right? This was a haven for them. Also, he was a businessman, and he saw there was a great potential in America, especially with Pennsylvania. In 1681, the first settlers came with Penn, and he came with the colonists, and he built a city, and that city was called Philadelphia, and he named it City of Brotherly Love. So Philadelphia. So he founded Philadelphia, and the colony became very successful because he used very wise tactics in building it. It preserved peace with the Native Americans. The Penn made sure that he paid the Native Americans for the land, and he didn't cheat them in any way. He was very religious in that way. And he encouraged religious freedom for all who believed in God. So he made a democratic system of government in Pennsylvania. Prosperous Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania became the most successful of the colonies, and it attracted many settlers from many, many countries. Many Germans came, and they were called the Pennsylvania Dutch, although they were German. Mennonites came, Amish came, German Reformed came, Dunkers and Schwenkfelders, all these different kinds of people came for freedom, religious freedom, to Pennsylvania. They all came to escape persecution in Europe. In 4 years, over 9,000 settlers came to Pennsylvania. Philadelphia became the important trade center and the largest city in the colonies at that time. And the Penn family controlled this area until the War of Independence. When I say controlled, they actually allowed them to govern themselves, but in the long run, they actually owned, still owned Pennsylvania until the War of Independence. Delaware. Well, Penn looked at Delaware. Remember we talked about New Jersey? That was of the York, became part of like the Duke of York's. Now we have Delaware. As Penn saw Delaware, see, Pennsylvania does not have a coast, so it needed access to the coast. So it looked to Delaware. In 1682, the Duke of York was convinced to grant Penn the southern part of Delaware. So he granted Delaware until 1704. Penn organized it into a separate colony of Delaware, but it actually was part of Pennsylvania, giving Pennsylvania access to the ports in the Atlantic Ocean. So now he was happy. Pennsylvania even would have a port, as Pennsylvania controlled the port of Delaware. All right, now we're going to go more south. We're going to talk about James Oglethorpe, and he founded Georgia, another proprietor. So this is very unusual because Georgia was settled much, much later. So we talk about the idea of James Oglethorpe from 1696 to 1785. He would settle not for profit because he wanted this to be a benevolent undertaking, meaning he wanted it to help people, especially poor people. So he was a wealthy Englishman, and he had a very generous spirit. He wanted to do good. He also was the chairman of the Parliament Committee on Prison Reform. So he noted in the prisons in England, there were lots of people in prison, lots of men in prison that were honest Englishmen in prison, but they were in there just because they were too poor to pay their debts. They were in debt. So he thought, well, we could put all of these debtors in Georgia and make it a refuge for prisoners so they could work out their debts in Georgia, kind of like they did with Australia. But this way, they would focus on the New World instead. So he thought, oh, let's take the colony of Georgia and bring in prison reformers and bring them in, all these debtors, and so it would be a prison reform type benevolent state. Did this happen? Well, let's find out. Well, King George II granted to Oglethorpe, Georgia, for this reason. It was a non-profit venture, of course. It was controlled by trustees for 21 years. Would all these prisoners be able to settle in Georgia in 21 years? Well, let's see. Then he returned to the crown as a royal colony. So after 21 years, if it didn't work, it would just be a royal colony. It wouldn't be a colony for this venture anymore. So the king intended for Georgia to be a buffer state between Florida, which was Spain, was controlled by Spain, and the prosperous Carolinas above. Carolinas above in Florida. So it basically wanted Georgia just to be a buffer state. of protection against Spanish coming in and taking over the prosperous South Carolina, right? So he wanted it also for fur production and silk production. He had other means, just not just the benevolent area for debtors, but he thought, if we can bring debtors there and they would do well, we'll see if this works. So Oglethorpe and his settlers arrived in 1733, few of them. And in fact, Oglethorpe founded Savannah, Georgia, and Georgia in honor of King George. Remember, King George was king at that time. So King George II is called Georgia. So here's a picture of King George there, and there's a picture of James Oglethorpe over there. And he wanted to reform the jail, be a jail reformer. Well, Georgia was set aside for prison reform, but it was not working. So each settler would be granted a small tract of land. And of course, in Georgia, slavery would be prohibited and nobody could use alcohol. No alcohol would be brought into Georgia. And he also promoted peace with the Native Americans. So those are some benevolent things, right? And Oglethorpe's troops also drove back some of the Spanish invasions that were happening too. So it also was a buffer between Florida and the Spanish state of Florida and Carolinas, just like the king thought. But the colony prospered not with prison reformers at all. Suddenly, German Lutherans started moving in, Moravians who came in because of religious persecution. Both the Lutherans and the Moravians and the Swiss Calvinists came in. These are all Bible groups coming in. The Scottish Covenanters came in to settle too. So these were all people that were coming to America for religious freedoms that they did not have in Europe. So we have Germans, we have Moravians, we have the Calvinists, the Swiss from Switzerland coming in, from Scotland, from different countries, all coming in to Georgia. So it failed as a benevolent undertaking, but it was drawing in a lot of people who would love to be able to settle there, for religious freedom. Eventually, large tracts of land would be granted then, and later on we know that a lot of these became used in full of slaves, and rum was accepted, and the things that it started off, it would not end up in Georgia. But in failing as a benevolent undertaking, it grew. And some debtors did come. In 1752, trustees returned Georgia to the king 1 year before the 21-year arrangement. Remember, the king said, you got 21 years to do this. Well, it didn't really work out, so it did go back to be a royal colony. Georgia became a royal colony. Of course, as we look back at these 13 colonies, as we go back all the way up from Massachusetts, from the Puritans in Massachusetts, as we studied, onto Connecticut and Rhode Island, the freedom between church and state in both Connecticut and Rhode Island, on to Massachusetts, Massachusetts moving on to Maine and New Hampshire, onto Penn with Pennsylvania, the freedom in Pennsylvania, and New Jersey being in New York, New Netherlands turning into New York and New Jersey, Delaware being part of Pennsylvania, onto what was happening in Virginia, way back to Jamestown in Virginia, onto North and South Carolinas, to finally Georgia. These would be the 13 colonies. And now that was a short time to populate the coast of a continent that was previously untouched by Europeans, and all these people were coming for freedom. Some came for freedom of religion, others for political freedom, some for economic freedom, but nearly all came to find freedom. And this brought unity to America, as America, despite the diversity and all the different kinds of people came, they all desired freedom. And they worked together for their foundations for a free nation. All of them, or most of them, I should say, had a strong belief in the Bible, the freedom of worship, a representative government, free enterprise, industry, frugality, brought a nation of freedom and prosperity. That's the end of this chapter. And we're going to go on to independence.